The night Wren Ashcombe touched the bell that had not rung in 40 brides, the entire hall would remember it as the moment the sky cracked open over Veirath, though she would only remember the cold of the iron under her palm and the way the king's eyes found hers before the sound even finished rolling through the rafters. What she didn't know, standing there in a borrowed gray dress with her hair still smelling of wood smoke and crushed yarrow, was that the bell had been silenced on purpose, that 40 women had stood where she stood and touched what she touched and felt nothing happen beneath their fingers because someone in that glittering hall had made very sure of it, and that the truth of who and why would not surface until blood had been spilled on the same stone floor, where brides were meant only to be chosen, never to bleed. She had come to the choosing the way she did everything in her life, quietly, at the edges, expecting to be overlooked, because overlooked was safe, and safe was what a girl learned to want when the whole of Thistlemere had spent 19 years calling her the Omega who never took. The healer's daughter with the scarred wrist and no bond to speak of, too plain to be chosen and too strange to be pitied properly. She had not asked to be dragged to the capital in the tribute cart with the other border girls, packed among baskets of dried lavender that were meant to disguise the smell of fear sweating off all of them, but Thistlemere owed tribute brides to the crown the way it owed grain and timber, an old law nobody living remembered the reason for, and her name had been drawn from the ledger by a steward who did not once look up from his ink. She told herself the whole journey that nothing would come of it, that the bell in the Hall of Vessa was a formality kept by kings who already knew who they wanted, that she would touch cold iron in front of a court that would not remember her face by supper, and then she would go home and go back to grinding willow bark and setting bones and being nobody, which had never once broken her heart before and would not start now. She was wrong about all of it, though the wrongness took its time arriving, the way a storm takes its time crossing open water, visible long before it breaks. The road into the capital wound along the Ashwater Pass, a narrow throat of stone between two black cliffs where, 3 days before the choosing, Wren's cart came apart from the caravan and found itself alone on the mountain road as dusk purpled into full dark, the driver cursing a cracked axle while the other tribute girls wept into their shawls. It was there, in that narrow throat of stone, that the world tilted on its axis for the first time. The attackers came down off the rocks like something poured rather than climbed. Men with filed teeth and iron collars who did not want brides, who wanted the king's personal guard riding 2 miles ahead and had settled, in their fury at missing him, for whatever smaller prize the mountain offered instead. Wren remembered later that she had not screamed, that some old stubborn thing in her chest had gone very still and very clear instead, the way it always did when a wound needed closing and there was no time to be afraid of the blood. She remembered dragging the driver behind the broken cart and pressing her palm hard over the artery in his thigh, and she remembered the sound that came down the pass after that, a sound like the mountain itself deciding to be angry, low and rolling and full of teeth. King Rurik Vane arrived not as a man, but as 7 feet of black furred fury with eyes the color of struck flint, and Wren would spend the rest of her life trying to describe to people who had not seen it what it looked like to watch a king unmake 4 armed men in under a minute without ever once losing the shape of restraint beneath the violence. As though, even at his most animal, he was counting every drop of force he spent. When it was over, he shifted back in the space between one breath and the next, naked and bleeding from a gash along his ribs that should have dropped a lesser man, and the first thing he did, before he reached for the cloak one of his guards threw at him, was look for the girl who had kept a dying man's blood inside his body, with nothing but her 2 hands and her own borrowed shawl. Their eyes met across the wreckage of the cart, and something in Wren's chest gave a single hard pull, like a fishhook set deep and yanked once, gone before she could name it, filed away as adrenaline, because the alternative was too large a thing to hold on a mountain road at midnight. He said nothing to her then beyond a rough command to his healer to see to her hands, which were shaking, though she hadn't noticed until someone else pointed it out. She said nothing back beyond a nod, because what did a border healer say to a king who had just torn 4 men apart to save a cart full of strangers he'd never asked to marry? The wound in his ribs, she would learn only later, did not close the way shifter wounds ought to. Not fully, not the way the court healers expected. And that small, ugly fact would matter more than anyone in that pass could have guessed. They rode the rest of the way to the capital in near silence, the king choosing, against all protocol, to have his own physician ride alongside Ren's wagon instead of the tribute caravan's assigned healer, an act his advisors would later call reckless, and his best friend would call obvious, though nobody said either word to his face. Ren spent those 2 days telling herself it meant nothing, that a king owed a debt to anyone who'd kept a man's blood where it belonged, that the warmth low in her stomach whenever she caught him watching her from horseback was simple exhaustion and nothing more, and she was still telling herself that lie when the gates of the capital rose up gold and terrible against the morning sky. And the whole glittering machinery of the choosing opened its jaws to receive her. The city of Veirath unfolded around Ren like something out of the fever dreams she used to have as a child, when a bad winter cough would send her mind wandering through impossible palaces built of ice and firelight. Towers of pale stone rose in tiers along the mountainside, each ringed with banners bearing the black wolf sigil of House Vane, and threading through all of it. Visible from nearly every street was the great domed roof of the Hall of Vesa, where the sky iron bell had hung since before the first Vane king took the throne. The court called it the Toll of Vesa, named for the healer queen who had supposedly forged it from a star that fell into the northern sea 1,000 years past, and the law surrounding it was older than any written contract in the kingdom, older even than the crown itself. A Vane king could take no queen the bell did not ring for, no matter what politics or armies or ambitions stood behind her. It was meant to be uncheatable, unbribable, a piece of the old magic too vast for court games to touch, and that, Ren would come to understand, was exactly why someone had spent 40 years and 40 brides making very sure it never rang at all. She was given a small room in the servants' wing rather than the guest quarters afforded the noble candidates, which suited her fine, because it meant fewer eyes on her and fewer chances to be laughed at by girls whose gowns cost more than her mother's entire cottage. It was there she met Sable, a broad-shouldered kitchen girl with flour permanently ground into the creases of her knuckles and a mouth that ran faster than her feet, who took one look at Ren's travel-stained dress and declared her a disaster in need of immediate adoption. Sable talked without pausing for breath about the other candidates, about which lord's daughter had tried to bribe a laundress for information on the king's preferences, about the legend of the bell, and how 40 brides in 4 decades had touched it and felt nothing. An unbroken silence so complete that half the kingdom had started calling it cursed rather than sacred. "There's nothing wrong with you being quiet about it," Sable said, dropping into the narrow bed across from Ren's like she'd known her for years instead of an hour. "Everyone quiet who comes through here gets eaten alive eventually. Might as well have someone loud on your side." Ren found herself laughing for the first time since Thistlemere, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and something in her chest loosened that she hadn't realized was clenched. It was Sable who first pointed out, in a whisper over breakfast, the small girl who haunted the kitchen corridors with a fox kit tucked inside her apron pocket, a scrawny orphan named Pip who belonged to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone in the scullery by unspoken agreement. Pip had opinions about everything, and volume enough to share them, and within a day she had adopted Wren the way stray things sometimes adopt the first person who doesn't flinch away from them, trailing her through the kitchen gardens, asking 100 questions a minute about healing herbs and whether the fox kit's limp could be fixed with the paste Wren used on scraped knees. The kit, whom Pip had named Ember for the rust color of her coat, had a foreleg that had healed crooked after some earlier cruelty nobody spoke of, and Wren spent an evening in the herb garden showing Pip how to wrap it properly, how to press just hard enough to ease the joint without causing more pain, and it was in that garden, hands full of crushed comfrey and a small girl's undivided attention, that Wren felt something in herself settle into a shape that fit. It was also in that garden, 2 evenings later, that the king found her. He came without guards, without the crown he wore for court, dressed simply enough that for one absurd moment Wren mistook him for one of the groundskeepers, until he turned and the flint-gray eyes gave him away entirely. He had come, he said, to see how the herbalist from Thistlemere fared, though the stiffness in his shoulders and the way his gaze kept dropping to the mostly healed gash along his ribs suggested the wound was doing something to him he did not fully understand, something no court physician could explain. Wren, without asking permission, without remembering to be intimidated by the largest and most powerful man in the kingdom, reached out and pressed 2 fingers just below the wound, feeling the heat still simmering beneath the skin. "It's not healing right," she said. "Something's fighting the closing." He went very still under her touch, the wolf beneath his skin going quiet and attentive in a way she couldn't see, but could somehow feel, like a held breath. "That's what my physicians tell me." He didn't move away. Neither did she. Not for a long moment, the 2 of them caught in the strange gravity of her hand against his ribs and the low gold light falling through the garden trellis, until Pip came barreling around the hedge with Ember scrambling after her, breaking the moment entirely, and the king laughed, an unguarded sound Wren suspected very few people in that palace had ever heard, and knelt to let the fox kit sniff his offered knuckles with the same careful patience he'd used tearing 4 men apart on a mountain road. Wren watched him with the child and the crooked-legged fox, and felt the fishhook in her chest pull again, harder this time, impossible now to mistake for exhaustion. The days that followed fell into a rhythm Wren hadn't expected and wasn't sure she was allowed to want. She was summoned, with increasing and thinly disguised excuses, to look at the wound along the king's ribs, which stubbornly refused to close the way shifter wounds should, and each summons left her a little more unsettled by how easily conversation came once the door shut behind them. How the low, rough voice that intimidated half his court turned almost boyish when Pip barged in uninvited to report on Ember's progress, or when Sable found some excuse to linger in doorways, watching the 2 of them with a knowing look Wren pretended not to notice. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a country by walking it rather than reading the map, that he had lost his older brother, the true heir, in a border skirmish a decade past, and had taken the crown never having wanted it, carrying it like a debt rather than a gift. That the wolf inside him, which he spoke of with the wry exhaustion of a man discussing an opinionated roommate, had gone half feral with grief in the year after his brother's death, and had only settled once Rurik himself stopped fighting the weight of the throne and started carrying it properly. That he had not expected, at 9 and 20, to still be unmarried. Unbonded, the bell silent through candidate after candidate, while his counsel grew louder every season about the dangers of an heirless throne. He did not say, not directly, that he had stopped hoping the bell would ever ring for anyone, but Wren heard it anyway, in the careful distance he kept from the subject, the way a man keeps distance from an old wound he's learned to walk around rather than heal. It was Lord Garrick Thorne who first made Wren understand just how precarious her place at court actually was. Thorne was a border lord with a voice built for parade grounds and a reputation, whispered gleefully by Sable, for treating every unbonded woman in the capital as a conquest owed to him by right of birth. He cornered Wren in a hallway off the East Garden on the 5th day, all bulk and bared teeth and the particular menace of a man used to nobody telling him no, informing her with a sneer that border trash had no business lingering near the king's private quarters, and that she'd do well to remember her tribute status before someone reminded her more forcefully. She didn't back down, though her pulse hammered loud enough to drown thought, and she was still holding her ground when a low sound rolled down the corridor that made Thorne's bravado curdle on his face in real time. Rurik didn't shift, didn't raise his voice, simply stepped between them with a stillness more frightening than any roar could have been. "You will not speak to her again," he said, each word a stone set carefully in a wall. Thorne opened his mouth to protest rank, protocol, the fact that he outranked a border healer by any measure that mattered in that palace, and Rurik cut him off with 2 words that ended the argument before it began. "I decide." Thorne left with his jaw locked tight and murder banked behind his eyes, and Wren understood, watching him go, that she had made an enemy who would not forget the humiliation, though she couldn't yet guess how small a piece he actually was in the game being played around her. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered out to the garden and found Rurik already there, staring up at the dome of the Hall of Vesa lit silver by the moon. "Does it frighten you?" she asked, sitting beside him without being invited, the possibility that it might never ring for anyone. He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "It used to," he said finally. "Now I think I'm more frightened it will ring for the wrong reasons than that it won't ring at all." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had in the mountain pass before anyone had thrown a cloak over his shoulders, and Wren felt the air between them go taut as a bowstring. He reached up, slow enough that she could have stopped him, and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his thumb grazing her cheekbone, and for one suspended heartbeat the whole glittering weight of the palace, and the crown, and the 40 silent brides fell away into nothing but his hand against her skin, and the low hum starting somewhere behind her ribs that had nothing to do with fear. She rose onto her toes without deciding to, and he bent to meet her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him like a hearth, close enough that his breath ghosted her mouth, and then the great horn atop the eastern watchtower split the night in 3 sharp blasts, the signal for a border rider arriving in crisis, and the moment shattered as completely as glass dropped on stone. Rurik's jaw tightened, the king reasserting himself over the man in the space of one breath, and he pressed his forehead briefly to hers, a promise without words, before he was gone into the dark toward the gatehouse, leaving Wren alone in the garden with her pulse still racing, and the unmistakable, terrifying certainty that whatever had almost happened between them was not going to stay almost, for very much longer. The border rider brought news that scattered the court's manufactured calm, like startled birds. Raiders in the north had struck a vain outpost, the same iron-collared men who'd ambushed Wren's cart in the pass, and this time they'd left a message instead of merely an attack, a demand scrawled on hide and nailed to the outpost gate, insisting the crown surrender its claim on the northern mining routes or face war before the season turned. Rurik was gone 3 days dealing with the fallout, and in his absence the court's undercurrents rose closer to the surface, whispered conversations that stopped when Wren entered a room, sidelong looks from noble candidates who had noticed exactly how often the king's private physician summoned the border healer to his chambers. Lady Isolde Marrow found her on the second day of his absence, in the palace library where Wren had taken to hiding among books on herb lore nobody else seemed to want. Isolde was the king's seer and senior advisor, a woman whose silver-threaded hair and perfectly composed features had survived 3 regimes of court politics without a single visible crack, and she settled into the chair across from Wren with the unhurried grace of someone who had never once needed to raise her voice to get what she wanted. "You've made quite an impression," Isolde said, her tone warm enough to seem like kindness if you didn't listen closely to the words underneath it. "The king hasn't looked at a candidate the way he looks at you in longer than I care to remember." Wren, wary without quite knowing why, said nothing beyond a careful thank you. Isolde smiled, and the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course," she went on, "the bell has never rung for a border girl, not once in the history of this house. I only mention it because I'd hate to see you hurt when it stays silent, as it always has." There was something underneath the concern that made the hair rise on Wren's arms, something coiled and patient, and she left the library that afternoon with the distinct sense of having been warned rather than comforted, though it would take her far too long to understand what exactly she'd been warned against. Rurik returned from the border grim-faced and short-tempered, the wound along his ribs somehow worse than when he'd left, angry red streaks spidering out from it that no shifter healing should have allowed, and it was Wren who noticed, cleaning the wound by lamplight while he sat rigid and silent in his private chambers, the faint metallic tang beneath the blood. A smell she recognized from her mother's warnings about poisoned blades used against shifter. "Kind. This isn't natural," she said, more to herself than to him, pressing a poultice of yarrow and crushed silverleaf against the wound. "Someone's been dosing you." He went very still. "With what?" She didn't have an answer yet, only a growing dread. But that night, working late in the herbal stores, trying to identify the faint bitter note she'd smelled in his blood, she found it by accident in an old apothecary ledger tucked behind newer stock, a substance called Grail ash, rare and expensive, used historically to numb shifter senses and in higher doses to dull magic entirely, including, the old text noted almost as an afterthought, the resonant magic of sacred iron. Her hands went cold. It was Lord Garrick Thorne who gave her the next piece, though not willingly. Furious over his public humiliation and drunk enough to be careless, he cornered Sable in a corridor 2 nights later, boasting with cruel relish that he wouldn't need the bell's blessing to secure his place at court, that certain people far above his station had already assured him the outcome of the choosing would go exactly as arranged, regardless of what any border healer thought she meant to. The king, Sable, thinking fast, played dumb and flattered him into saying more, and what she brought back to Wren that night, breathless and pale, was enough to turn Wren's blood to ice. Thorne believed, or had been told to believe, that the bell's silence wasn't chance or curse, but design, that someone at court had been ensuring its silence for years to keep the succession exactly where certain families wanted it, and that whoever controlled the bell's silence controlled the crown itself. Wren thought immediately of Grail ash, of the ledger, of Isolde's soft warning in the library, and the pieces did not yet form a full picture, but the shape of one was there, waiting in the dark like something with teeth. She went to Rurik that night, not as a healer, but as something closer to what she was becoming, and found him in the practice yard working off frustration on a training post. Shirt discarded, the poultice she'd bound that morning already darkening, with sweat and old blood. She told him everything, the ledger, Thorne's drunken boast, Isolde's warning, watching his face harden into the stillness she now recognized as the mask he wore over rage too large for a room. "Garrick is a fool who repeats what smarter people tell him to say," he said finally. "He's not smart enough to orchestrate anything himself. Someone above him. Someone with access to the bell chamber and the physician's stores both." There was only a handful of people in the palace who moved freely through both, and the list, when Wren made herself think it through fully, was short enough to make her stomach drop. That night, for the first time since the garden, he reached for her again, no horn interrupting this time, and when his mouth finally found hers, it was not gentle so much as it was certain, a claiming of something they'd both been circling for weeks, his hands careful even in their hunger, checking, always checking, that she wanted this as much as he did, and she did. She wanted it with a fierceness that frightened her a little, but even wrapped around him in the dark, she felt the cold thread of dread Isolde had planted refusing to fully dissolve, the sense that whatever was coming would not wait politely for them to be ready for it. The choosing ceremony was set for the night of the full moon, in keeping with tradition older than the crown itself, and in the days leading up to it the palace filled with a nervous, glittering tension that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with power-changing hands. Wren spent those days torn between the private warmth of stolen hours with Rurik, hours that felt like the only honest thing in that whole gilded city, and the growing dread of what she and Sable had begun to uncover in the palace archives, working by candlelight through records of the last 40 choosings, cross-referencing physicians' logs against the mysteriously recurring purchases of Grail ash, always requisitioned under the seal of the royal seer's office, always timed within days of a choosing ceremony. Isolde Marrow, they came to understand, had been dosing the bell's clapper mechanism itself for 4 decades, a slow poison of silence administered so carefully that no single choosing looked suspicious on its own, only the unbroken pattern of 40 silences gave the game away, and the why of it took longer to surface than the how. It was Pip, of all people, who handed them the final piece, chattering one afternoon in the kitchen garden about the girl who sometimes visited Lady Isolde in secret, a pale, quiet noblewoman named Faye, who everyone in the servants' wing knew was Isolde's daughter, though it was never spoken of at court, because Faye's father had been a disgraced lesser lord whose bloodline carried no claim to the throne at all, which meant that if the bell ever rang true and produced an heir through some ordinary bonded pairing, Faye's own quietly nursed hope of one day being positioned as the crown's ward and eventual regent's favorite would evaporate entirely. Isolde doesn't want the bell silenced forever, Wren realized aloud, the pieces slotting into place with sickening clarity. She wants it silent until she can arrange for it to ring for Faye. A false ringing, engineered somehow, timed to a moment when no true rival candidate remained to complicate things. Sable's face had gone pale. "Which means," she said slowly, "the king isn't just target of a poisoning to weaken him. He's being kept alive and hobbled, on purpose, until she's ready to move." The choosing ceremony would give Isolde exactly the moment she needed, a hall full of witnesses, a king weakened by 4 decades of careful sabotage, and a bell that had never once rung true, primed to finally speak the moment its silencer chose to let it. Wren brought everything to Rurik that night, laying out the ledgers, Pip's overheard gossip, the pattern of purchases, watching something in him go past anger into a cold clarity she recognized from the mountain pass, the same counted, deliberate violence held carefully in check. "We can't move against her without proof the court will accept," he said. "She's served 3 kings. My own council would call it madness." "Then we get proof," Wren said, and the plan that formed between them that night, reckless and thin as it was, hinged on the one thing Isolde could not falsify, the bell itself. If Ren touched it honestly, without the Grail ash Isolde would surely have applied fresh for the ceremony, and the bell rang true regardless, it would be undeniable. A bond too old and too sacred for any court politics to dismiss. If it didn't ring, they would have lost nothing they hadn't already been prepared to lose. The night of the choosing arrived, wrapped in silver moonlight and banners snapping in a wind that smelled like the first edge of autumn, and Ren stood in the receiving line among candidates dressed finer than she would ever be, feeling steadier than she had any right to feel. Sable's hand squeezing hers once before she was called forward, Pip watching wide-eyed from the servants' gallery with Ember clutched to her chest. Lord Garrick Thorne, humiliated and desperate to reclaim some shred of standing, chose that exact moment to make his final grasping move, shoving forward out of turn to seize Ren's wrist and drag her toward the dice, snarling something about border trash not deserving to go first. And it was Rurik, faster than thought, who closed the distance and drove Thorne back with a single open-handed blow that sent the larger man sprawling across the marble in front of the entire assembled court, humiliation complete and public and, crucially, entirely deserved, ending Thorne's threat not with violence dressed as spectacle, but with the simple, undeniable fact of a king protecting what was his in front of witnesses who would talk about it for years. It was, Ren understood even as her heart still hammered from the shock of it, the end of the obvious danger, and not the true one. Because, as Thorne was dragged away cursing, Ren caught Isolde's eyes across the hall, calm, composed, faintly amused, the eyes of a woman who had simply been waiting for the noise to clear so the real performance could finally begin. The hall fell into the particular hush that precedes ceremony, candles guttering along the walls, the great sky iron bell hanging silent and dark above the dais where it had hung silent through 40 brides before her. Isolde stepped forward to officiate, as she had officiated every choosing for 40 years, her voice pitched to carry, warm and reasonable and utterly without visible seam. And Ren watched her hands as she moved through the ceremonial motions, watched for the telltale application of Grail ash to the clapper mechanism that she and Rurik had gambled everything on catching. It came exactly as predicted, disguised as a ritual anointing, a small vial of pale dust that Isolde tipped with practiced, unhurried fingers along the bell's inner rim, while murmuring words the court believed to be ancient blessing, and Ren now knew to be poison. Rurik's hand found Ren's at exactly that moment, steadying, a silent confirmation that he'd seen it too. And when Isolde straightened and gestured for the first candidate to approach, he stepped forward instead, breaking protocol entirely, and asked, in a voice that filled the hall without seeming to rise at all, what exactly the seer had just anointed the bell with. The composure on Isolde's face didn't crack so much as it froze, a held breath of an expression, and she recovered fast enough that a lesser room might have believed her explanation about traditional oils and old blessings. But Rurik had already produced the ledgers Ren and Sable had spent nights assembling, 40 years of Grail ash requisitions bearing the seer's own seal, laid bare before a court that went from murmuring to dead silent in the span of a single indrawn breath. Faye Marrow, watching from the noble gallery, went white as bone. Isolde's mask didn't fully break until Rurik said her daughter's name aloud, laid the whole shape of the scheme in front of the court plainly, 40 brides silenced not by curse, but by careful poison so that the throne could be walked generation by generation toward a bloodline that had no true claim to it at all. And something in the seer's face finally gave way to something raw and furious, and cornered. She moved fast for a woman her age, faster than anyone expected, snatching a ceremonial blade from the dais altar, not for the king, whose shifter reflexes she knew better than to test directly, but for the one person in that hall who had upended 40 years of careful work with nothing but a ledger and a border healer's stubbornness. She lunged for Ren. Rurik moved to intercept and was a half-step too far, his wounded ribs slowing him just enough, and in that suspended, terrible half-second Ren saw the blade coming and did not think of running, thought instead, with a clarity that surprised her even as it happened, of Pip in the gallery, of the fox kit with the crooked leg, of her mother's hands over a dying man's wound in Thistlemere, of every small mercy she had ever chosen over fear. And something long dormant in her chest tore open at last. It came not as fire, but as light, a silver-gold flare erupting outward from her raised hands, instinctive and enormous, catching Isolde's blade an inch from Ren's throat and holding it there, suspended. While the light poured through the hall like something remembering an old shape it hadn't worn in centuries. The old ledger Ren had found without understanding it, tucked among the healer's records, the one about a forgotten bloodline of the healer Queen Vesa herself. The line the Sky Iron Bell had actually been forged to recognize, made sudden and blinding sense. Isolde's blade, caught in that purifying light, began to glow white-hot in her own grip, the Grail ash coating it reacting violently against a magic it had spent 40 years suppressing, and she screamed and released it a half-second too late, the backlash of her own poison catching her hand and arm, dropping her to the marble floor in convulsing agony, while the light around Ren settled, slowly, into something warm rather than blinding. Above them, freed at last of the dust that had silenced it through 40 brides, the Sky Iron Bell began, impossibly, to ring. Not struck by any hand, but simply ringing, low and clear and endless. The sound of something ancient recognizing what it had been forged to recognize, filling the hall until every person in it, noble and servant alike, felt it resonate in their own chest like a second heartbeat. The bell's ringing did not stop for nearly a full minute, long enough that the sound seemed to soak into the stone itself, long enough for the entire court to understand, without needing to be told twice, that whatever had just happened in front of them was not political theater, but something far older and far less arguable. Isolde was carried from the hall under guard, her scorched arm wrapped hastily by a physician who would not meet her eyes. Her daughter Faye led away separately, weeping, protesting ignorance that nobody in that hall fully believed, and that Rurik, in the following days, would choose not to fully punish anyway, sentencing the girl to exile in a distant border holding rather than the execution his. Counsel quietly urged a mercy that cost him politically and that he extended without hesitation the moment Ren asked it of him. Because Faye, whatever her mother had made of her, had been a pawn in a game older than her own life, and Ren found she could not stomach the idea of answering one silenced life with another. Isolde herself did not survive the week, the Grail ash that had soaked into her burned skin, the same poison she had used against a king and 40 silenced bells, proved, in the end, no kinder to her than it had been to anyone else she dosed with it, and she died in the healer's wing with her composure finally completely gone, undone by her own careful cruelty in a way that felt less like justice delivered from outside and more like a debt calling itself due. Ren sat with Rurik in the aftermath, in the quiet of his chambers with the bells ringing still humming faintly in her bones, and found herself shaking for the first time since the mountain pass, the adrenaline finally catching up to what her body had done without asking permission. He held her through it, saying very little, his hand steady over the spot on her chest where the light had come from, and it was there, hours later, that the interrupted moment from the garden finally found its ending, unhurried now. No horn to break it, no danger crouched outside the door, just the two of them and the low golden lamplight, and a bond finally allowed to exist in the open instead of stolen in stray hours between crises. His voice rough against her hair, asking her, again and again in different small ways, whether this was truly what she wanted, and her answer, given without hesitation, settling something in him she suspected had been unsettled since the day his brother died. The court, in the weeks that followed, adjusted itself around the new reality with the particular speed court's reserve for facts too large to argue with. A bell that rang audibly for the entire capital to hear was not a rumor to be managed, but a truth to be accommodated. And Wren Ashcombe, border healer, tribute bride, the Omega the whole of Thistlemere had once called too plain and too strange to be chosen, found herself instead the acknowledged bonded queen of Veirath, a fact that took considerably longer to feel real to her than it did to anyone watching from outside. Sable was given a permanent post in the royal household on Wren's insistence, promptly appointing herself unofficial minister of telling the queen when she was being ridiculous, a job she performed with tremendous enthusiasm. Pip, unwilling to be separated from either Wren or the king she had adopted with a child's uncomplicated certainty, was given rooms in the family wing and a standing invitation to the kitchen gardens whenever she liked, Ember trotting at her heels with a limp that had, under months of careful care, become barely noticeable at all. Lord Garrick Thorne, stripped of standing and sent home to his border holding in disgrace, became a story the court told at dinners for exactly as long as court stories usually lasted, which was to say, not very. The seasons turned the way seasons do, indifferent to the size of what had happened beneath them, and Veirath settled into a rhythm that felt, to Wren's quiet astonishment, less like a fairy tale concluded, and more like an ordinary life simply being allowed to happen at last. She kept her healer's satchel, refusing every suggestion from the court tailors that a queen had no business grinding her own willow bark, and spent a portion of most mornings in the same herb garden where she'd first shown Pip how to wrap a fox-kit's crooked leg. The beds now expanded under her direction to include half the herb lore of Thistlemere transplanted north. Cuttings sent up by her own mother, who wrote letters full of blunt maternal pride that made Wren laugh and cry in roughly equal measure. Rurik's wound, once the last traces of Grail ash worked free of his blood, healed clean and whole for the first time in months, and the wolf beneath his skin, Wren learned over the following year, had opinions of its own about all of it, expressed mostly through an increased and faintly ridiculous fondness for napping in sunbeams whenever Wren was nearby, a habit Rurik found deeply undignified and did absolutely nothing to stop. The throne room's old formality softened by degrees, border lords finding themselves received with the same warmth as capital nobility, a policy that raised eyebrows among the old guard, and was received in villages like Thistlemere as the first real proof in living memory that the crown remembered the border existed at all. It was on an ordinary evening, roughly a year after the bell had rung, that Rurik found Wren in the herb garden at dusk. The light gone the particular gold it had been the evening he'd first come looking for her with an unhealed wound and a question he hadn't known how to ask yet, and this time he came with a small carved box instead. Containing a ring worked from a sliver of the sky iron bell itself, offered by the court smiths as a gift once they understood what it meant to the two of them, and he asked her, plainly, without any of the careful court language his advisors had tried to press on him, to marry him properly, in front of everyone this time, no ceremony hidden behind politics, just the two of them choosing each other in the open the way the bell had already told the whole kingdom they belonged to. She said yes, with her hands still full of crushed comfrey, laughing, and he kissed her right there among the herb beds, while Pip whooped from the garden gate and Ember yipped along in excited agreement, and Sable watching from the kitchen window, declared loudly to anyone who'd listen that she'd known it since the disaster in the gray traveling dress and deserved considerably more credit than she was getting. The wedding, when it came, was small by royal standards and enormous by Wren's, half of Thistlemere making the long journey north to fill the pews beside Veirath's nobility, her mother crying openly through the whole ceremony. And 2 years after that, a second small event rearranged the shape of their household entirely. A daughter born in the depths of winter, with her mother's steady hands and, everyone swore, her father's exact flint-gray eyes, named Vesa after the healer queen whose old blood had apparently been waiting patiently in a border village for 19 years to finally be recognized. Pip, 13 now and utterly certain of her role as the resident expert on all matters royal infant-related, appointed herself the baby's fiercest protector within a week, with Ember, grayer around the muzzle now but still spry, taking up permanent residence at the nursery door as though standing guard were the fox's own idea entirely. The sky iron bell still hung in the hall of Vesa, and though it had rung only the once in Wren's hearing, the court had come, over the years, to treat its silence differently than it once had, no longer a mark of shame or curse, but simply a bell at rest. Waiting, the way old sacred things wait, for whenever it might be needed again. Wren still visited the hall sometimes in the quiet hours, running her fingers along the cold curve of it the way she had that first night in the borrowed gray dress, remembering the girl who had walked in expecting to be overlooked and had instead, without ever meaning to, torn a 40-year silence wide open. She thought, more than she expected to, about the choices that had brought her there, the mercy she'd asked for Faye Marrow, who had written to her twice from her border exile with something that read, cautiously, like the beginnings of remorse, about the strange grace of a wound that had refused to heal properly until it forced two people together who might otherwise have spent a lifetime standing in the same hallways without ever truly seeing each other. On the evening of little Vesa's second birthday, the family gathered in the herb garden as the sun went down gold over the mountains, Rurik with his daughter balanced easily on one hip, the wolf beneath his skin content and quiet the way it only ever was in that particular garden, Sable directing an enthusiastic and largely unnecessary effort to hang lanterns in the fruit trees, Pip, nearly grown now, teaching Vesa the names of the herbs the same patient way Wren had once taught her, Ember curled in a patch of late sun with the boneless contentment of an old creature who had long since earned her rest. Wren stood at the edge of it all for a moment, just watching, the way she sometimes still did when the ordinary happiness of it threatened to overwhelm her more than any danger ever had, and Rurik came to stand beside her, his free hand finding hers the way it always did now, easy and certain, no fishhook pull anymore, just the steady warm hum of a bond long since settled into the shape of a life. Ember stretched, yawned enormously, and flopped over to press herself against Pip's ankle with a small, satisfied huff, and Pip looked up at Wren with the same wide, unguarded grin she'd worn the very first day in the kitchen garden, entirely unbothered by how much had changed around her, as though the important things, the fox curled warm against her foot, the family gathered in golden light, had simply always been exactly this certain. Some endings are quiet like that. Until next time.